Montana Territory, April 1880. It was past sundown when Priscilla Garner stepped into the dry goods store in Elkhorn, wind-chapped and hollow-eyed, cradling nothing but a small velvet box in her gloved hand. The door creaked shut behind her, and the low lantern light caught the gold ring she pulled from the box, thin, worn, and still catching light like it had the day her husband slid it onto her finger. "I need flour," she said to the shopkeeper, placing the ring on the counter. "And beans. Whatever this'll get me." The shopkeeper, Mr. Leland, looked down at the band, then up at Priscilla. "You sure?" "No," she said softly. "But I do not have a choice." She had not eaten since the day before. She had not cried since her husband's grave softened with the spring thaw. She had no money, no livestock, and no way to get back east. What she had was 2 children, Jude, age 8, and Josie, 5, waiting in a drafty shack on the edge of the prairie, curled under horse blankets and too quiet for their age. Leland sighed and slid the ring toward himself. "I can give you a sack of flour and half a pound of beans. That is all I can do." Priscilla nodded, eyes dry. She watched him bag the food, then reached to take the supplies and froze when a man's voice cut in low behind her. "I will cover it," the man said. "And she can keep the ring." She turned. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a dark wool coat still dusted with snow, hat tucked under one arm. His hair was black, long enough to curl at his collar, and his eyes were the kind that held steady. Not kind exactly, but steady. The kind that had seen things and did not flinch. "I do not take charity," Priscilla said, straightening. "Neither do I," he said. "But I do not believe in letting a woman pawn her name." She opened her mouth to protest, but the shopkeeper was already bagging more food, dried meat, cornmeal, a small wedge of cheese. "Zane Ritter," the man said, offering his hand. "I own the Ritter place west of town." She did not take his hand. "I do not need help." "You walk 12 miles in the cold with a wedding ring in your pocket," he said evenly. "You need more than help." "I have children." "I figured." He picked up one of the sacks and handed it to her. "I have horses." "I will take you home." "I said no charity." "I am not offering charity," he said. "I am offering a ride. You can be proud later." That stunned her into silence. She followed him out under the darkening sky because she had no other option, because the weight of the flour was too much for just her arms, and because her children needed food more than she needed pride. He saddled a bay gelding and helped her into the wagon without asking again. They rode in silence. The snow had stopped, but the wind had not. Spring came slow in Montana. Priscilla pulled her shawl tighter and looked out at the prairie as they passed fields still buried in frost. She said nothing, and neither did he until the cabin came into view, small, leaning slightly, and lit from within by a single kerosene lamp. "You live here alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Since Samuel died." "How long?" 3 months. She paused, added, "He was thrown from the draft horse. Broke his back. Died that night?" Zane nodded like he understood. "And no family?" "None that would take us. We came here to start something new." He was going to farm the land. "We were going to make it work." His voice was quiet. "You still trying to?" "I have to," she said. "For them." The wagon rumbled to a stop. Before she could climb down, the door of the cabin opened, and Jude came running out, barefoot and pale-faced. "Mama!" Priscilla slid off the wagon, catching him in her arms, then turned toward the door where Josie stood blinking sleepily, her curls wild. "We have food," Priscilla said, forcing a smile. "Go inside, baby." Zane handed her the sacks. "This will not last long." "I know," she said. "I need help mending fences," he said. "And I have more food than I can eat alone. You cook, you clean, and you bring those too with you. I will pay you fair." "That is not charity. That is work." She blinked at him. "You would hire me?" He glanced at the cabin. "They need more than a shack and a mother about to fall over." Priscilla's throat clenched. She did not want to cry in front of him. "Think about it," he said, stepping back into the wagon seat. "I will be by tomorrow. Sun up." Then he turned the horses and left, wheels crunching over half-melted snow. She stood in the dark for a long time after he was gone, staring out into the night, arms tight around her children. Then she looked at the ring pressed into her palm, still warm from the shopkeeper's counter. She did not sleep that night. But when the sun rose soft and gold through the thinning clouds, Priscilla had her children dressed and a small sack packed. She tied her hair back. She tucked the ring into her pocket. And when Zane pulled up in his wagon at sunup, she was waiting. The morning was still holding its breath when Zane guided the wagon west, reins loose in his hands. Frost clung to the meadowgrass, and the mountains beyond Elkhorn stood blue and unmoved. Priscilla sat beside him, her children nestled between sacks and bedrolls in the back, lulled by the creak and sway of the wheels. She had tied her shawl close, her hands folded in her lap, and she did not speak until they passed the last fence post marking town land. "You said you needed fence work," she said, her voice low. "What happened to your help?" He didn't look at her. He left before the thaw. Thought he'd find better wages in Helena. "Might have too. You live alone out there?" "I do." She nodded once, then turned her attention to the road ahead. Sagebrush rolled past in patches, and the land slowly tilted upward into the skirts of the hills. With each mile, the wind thinned and the hush of open space settled heavier. They passed a pair of antelope grazing beyond a frozen creek. Jude spotted them and pressed his face to the side rail of the wagon, eyes wide. Zane caught the boy's stare and cleared his throat. "You ever ride before?" he asked him. Jude hesitated, then shook his head. Zane tipped his hat back. "We'll fix that." Priscilla glanced at him, uncertain. "You mean to teach him?" "Figure if he's gonna be around stock, he ought to know what he's doing." She studied him a moment, but said nothing more. By midday, the land opened to a broad valley, and Zane's ranch came into view. The house sat low and square with a stone chimney and porch shaded by a slatted overhang. Beyond it, a barn and corral stretched wide, with horses shifting in the paddock and 2 milk cows grazing farther out. There was no fence around the house, just open ground and stacked wood near the door. Zane pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, then offered his hand to Josie first. She looked to her mother before accepting it, her fingers barely curling around his. Priscilla stepped down without help, her boots crunching over the frost-hardened dirt. She took in the place with a long, measured look. Smoke drifted from the chimney and the porch boards looked recently mended. "You built this yourself?" she asked. "My father did," he said. "I've added on some." He led them inside. The warmth met them in a slow wave with heat and the scent of coffee lingering in the air. The room opened wide, with plank floors, a cast-iron stove, and a long table with mismatched chairs. There was a woven rug near the hearth and a bookshelf lined with weathered volumes. Everything was neat, but lived in. No sign of decoration, just use. Zane motioned toward a doorway on the right. "That room's yours. It's small, but it shuts." Priscilla stepped inside. The room held a narrow bed, a washstand with a chip basin, and a trunk at the foot of the bed. A single window let in the pale light. It was more comfort than she'd known in weeks. "I'll take the boy with me to the barn," Zane said from the doorway. "You settle her in." She turned. "You don't have to take him." He met her eyes. "I know." She watched him cross the yard with Jude at his side, the boy ducking his head against the wind. Josie tugged her skirt. "Mama, is this his house?" "Yes," she said, kneeling to brush straw from the hem of her daughter's dress. "But we'll be staying here for a while." "Is he nice?" Priscilla paused, then pulled Josie close. "He's quiet." "That's not the same thing." Inside the barn, Jude stood stiffly near the tack wall while Zane forked hay into the troughs. The air was thick with the smell of horses and dust. Zane worked without speaking at first, letting the boy watch. Then, without turning, he said, "You ever throw a saddle?" Jude shook his head. "Well," Zane said, "you'll learn." The boy stepped closer. "Mama says I got strong hands. From splitting kindling." Zane nodded. "That'll help." They worked in companionable silence, the kind that held no weight but meant something all the same. By evening, Priscilla had unpacked what little she owned into the chest, washed Josie's hands and face, and boiled cornmeal over the stove. Zane returned from the barn with Jude in tow, both dusted in straw and smelling faintly of leather. As they ate, the only sound was the clink of spoons and the occasional snap of the fire. Zane sat at one end of the table, Priscilla at the other, the children in between. After the meal, Jude dozed in the rocker by the hearth while Josie curled beside her mother on the rug. Zane stood by the window, looking out into the dark. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. She didn't answer right away. "You don't know me. I know what I see." Priscilla looked up at him. "And what's that?" "A woman who's still standing," he said. "That counts for something." She watched him a long moment, then rose and gathered the dishes. Outside, the wind shifted. The kindling pile rested full beside the door. The night deepened and the silence in the house no longer felt like absence but space, room enough to breathe. That night, Priscilla lay awake beneath clean quilts, the ring still in her pocket. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to be taken away. By the end of May, the snowmelt had fed the riverbanks and turned the pastures thick with green. Work came with the thaw fence posts to replace where frost had heaved them, calves to brand, and garden rows to dig before the soil dried out. Priscilla rose before the rooster most mornings, pulling bread from the coals and shaking Josie awake before the sun crested the ridgeline. She never asked what Zane expected from her beyond the work, and he never tried to explain. One morning, he found her in the garden with her sleeves rolled up and her skirt pinned back from the knees. She was kneeling in the turned earth, hands stained from pulling bindweed out by the roots. Josie sat nearby with a wooden spoon and a pot of water, elbow deep in her own quiet game. Zane leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. "You always plant in straight lines?" Priscilla looked up, squinting. "If you don't, you'll never know what's a weed and what's food." He stepped down into the row beside her and crouched. "What's that one?" "Turnip." He pointed again. "And that? Also turnip." She glanced sideways. "You're not much of a farmer, are you?" "Never said I was. But I can dig a hole. You want another pair of hands?" She nodded and he fetched the spade. They worked without speaking for a while, the sun warming the backs of their necks, the air thick with the smell of fresh soil. A magpie called from the cottonwoods behind the barn, and a breeze carried the scent of wild onion from the edge of the field. After a while, Zane leaned on the spade. "You ever think about selling the land?" She paused, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "I did once, after Sam died, but it would have meant leaving everything we tried for." "You ever think about marrying again?" Her body stilled. She didn't look at him. "That's not something I can afford to think about." "I didn't mean it like a stranger might ask it," he said. "I meant it plain." She sat back on her heels. "Are you offering something plain?" He met her eyes. "I am." She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her skirt. Her voice was quiet but sure. "You don't know what I'd be bringing with me. I've seen you carry a child on your hip and a water bucket in your hand at the same time," he said. "I know enough. You'd be taking on more than mouths to feed." "I know that too." She stepped closer, the space between them narrowing. "And if I said I couldn't feel anything yet not anything like a woman ought to when she says yes, what then?" Zane didn't shift. "Then I'd wait. I'm not asking for anything you can't give." Josie tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Priscilla knelt and picked her up, holding her close. She looked back at Zane over her daughter's shoulder. "You'd really wait?" "I already am." That night, after the children were asleep, she stepped out onto the porch. The sky stretched wide and dark above her, stars sharp and scattered like frost over black stone. Zane was sitting on the steps, sharpening a blade by lantern light, the metal whispering over the whetstone. She sat beside him without a word. After a while, she said, "I kept the ring." He didn't stop sharpening. "Good. I thought about giving it back to the earth. But I couldn't. It's not wrong to remember." She rested her hands in her lap. "If I ever did say yes, it wouldn't be because I forgot Samuel." He looked at her. "I'd never ask you to." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from the foothills. She watched the lantern flame flicker and steady again. "Jude started calling you sir without me telling him to. I noticed. He trusts you. I'm glad." She turned to him, her voice softer now. "I'm learning to." He didn't answer, but he set the whetstone aside and laid the blade across his knees. They sat there for a long time, lantern light between them, the silence not heavy but full. When she finally stood to go inside, she touched his shoulder barely and left her hand there for a breath longer than necessary. He didn't move. She didn't need to say anything else that night. The summer heat settled in slow and heavy, thickening the air with dust and pine pitch. By early July, the creek behind the barn had thinned to a trickle, and even the horses stood quiet in the shade, tails twitching lazily. Priscilla spent her mornings tending the garden and her afternoons sewing under the porch where the boards stayed cool. Her hands had grown calloused but surer, and she stitched without looking now, mending shirts Zane had worn near to threadbare. Zane came in from the hayfield just as the sun dipped low, his shirt plastered to his back and straw clinging to his boots. He nodded once at her and disappeared into the washroom without a word. She watched the door swing closed behind him, then turned back to her needlework. When he re-emerged, hair damp and shirt changed, she set the sewing aside. "I've been thinking," she said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "That's usually the start of something. I'd like to teach. I had schooling back in Illinois, enough to read and write proper. Jude's sharp and Josie's starting to ask about letters." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You want to teach them here?" "I want to teach whoever'll send their children. Not just mine." Zane's brow furrowed, but not in disagreement. "You'd need a place. I thought maybe the church hall in town. It's empty most days." He nodded slowly. "You'd have to convince the council." "I know. You sure you got time for that and all this?" "I've done harder with less." He didn't argue. That evening, she sat with the children beneath the cottonwood out back, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. Jude corrected Josie's shaky S, and Priscilla leaned back on her hands, watching them with a quiet pride she never spoke aloud. Zane came by with 2 tin cups and offered her one. "Lemon balm," he said. "Grows wild behind the barn." She took the cup, sipped. "You picked it yourself? I'm not completely useless outside a saddle." She smiled, faint but real. They watched the children chase fireflies as the sky went soft with dusk. Zane rested the heel of his boot against a tree root and looked at her sideways. "Your voice changes when you talk about teaching," he said. "How's that?" "Get steadier. Like you're not carrying something when you say it." "I suppose because it's the one thing I still own." He was quiet a moment. "I talked to the sheriff last week. He said folks been asking if you're staying for good." She didn't look at him. "Am I? I hope so." The air stretched long between them. Somewhere across the valley, a coyote called. Josie climbed into her mother's lap, half asleep, arms wrapped around her neck. Priscilla laid her cheek against the girl's hair. "Samuel would have liked it here," she said, not as a comparison, but a truth laid down gently. Zane nodded. "He sounded like a good man." "He was. You didn't lose him to weakness." "No," he looked at her then, steady and unflinching. "And I'm not offering myself out of loneliness." She met his gaze. "That's not why I'd say yes." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "Josie left this on the porch step this morning. Thought I ought to return it." She opened it. A crooked drawing of 4 stick figures holding hands under a triangle roof with a sun drawn too big in the corner. Jude's name was written in careful letters. Josie had scrawled hers in backward JS. She folded it again and held it in her lap. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Not of trying." He didn't speak, but he reached over and rested his hand over hers, calloused palm warm against her fingers. She didn't pull away. When the stars came out, they stayed seated under that tree while the children dozed nearby, and the night wrapped around them like something old and kind. There were no promises made aloud, but something shifted then, not sudden, not loud. Just a quiet turning toward, like a door easing open to a light not yet seen, but longed for all the same. The sky had softened to the color of buttermilk, and the heat had broken at last. It was late August, and the first school term Priscilla had organized in town was winding to a close. She stood on the church hall steps with a slate in one hand and Josie's fingers curled around the other, watching the last of the children scatter home across the packed Earth Street. Jude lingered near the edge, talking to a boy 2 years older, his chin lifted with something like confidence. She hadn't seen him stand that way before. Zane leaned against the wagon, waiting. He'd driven them into town that morning and spent the day at the blacksmith's, trading lumber for repairs and setting iron shoes on a younger mare. His shirt was streaked with soot and his forearms were dusted with iron filings. "You done teaching them all how to conquer the world?" he asked. She stepped down. "Today we settled for long division." He opened the back of the wagon, helping Josie up without asking. "You going to keep with it after harvest?" "If they'll have me." The councils offered use of the hall through spring. He looked toward the church, then back at her. "You've done more than they expected." "I've done what I could." He nodded, then reached behind the seat and drew out a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Something came on the freight wagon from Helena. She hesitated, taking it carefully. Inside was a small wooden box and, within it, a hand-bound ledger book. She opened the cover. The pages were lined and thick, untouched. "It's for your school records," he said. "Thought you might want something better than scraps." She ran her thumb lightly over the spine. "You ordered this?" He shrugged. "Figured it'd last longer than chalk dust." Her eyes lifted to his, and something passed between them that didn't need explaining. They rode home with the sun low and warm behind them. Josie dozed curled against the sack of oats. Jude asked if he could help Zane with the animals when they got back, and she said yes before Zane could, trusting the rhythm they'd found. After supper, she stepped outside, leaving the children rinsing their tin plates in the basin. Crickets were singing in the grass, and the cottonwoods rustled with the promise of the season turning. Zane was oiling the hinges on the smokehouse door, his work quiet as ever. She crossed to him. "I've been thinking again." He set the tin can down. "Ought I be worried?" She folded her arms, studying his face in the last of the light. "You've never told me what you want out of this." He straightened. "You mean the land?" "No," she said. "Me." He was quiet for a breath. "Then I want a life that fits the hands of God. I want a woman beside me who doesn't flinch at storms. And I want to build something that don't fall apart when the wind shifts." She took a step closer. "And you think I'm that woman?" "I don't think it," he said. "I know it." Her voice wavered but did not fall. "Then I'm saying yes." He reached for her hand, rough palm warm against her wrist. "To what?" "To all of it." He pulled her in slowly, as if he was still asking permission. She didn't hesitate. Their foreheads touched first, then their mouths, slow and certain. She tasted salt and dust and the last of summer in his kiss. There was no rush in it, no fear, just the quiet certainty of something long tended finally taking root. That night, she told the children they would be staying for good. When the leaves turned gold and brittle, they married under the cottonwood behind the house. No preacher, just a paper signed in town and a circle of neighbors gathered with fresh bread and preserved peaches. Jude stood beside Zane, proud and tall in a coat a size too big, and Josie tucked wildflowers into her mother's braid. Later, as the sun dipped behind the barn and the lanterns were lit, Zane took her hand and led her into the house they'd made theirs. No words, just the kind of silence that had always carried more than noise ever could. Winters came hard in Montana, but they were ready. The pantry stayed full. The children grew. Priscilla taught through the snow, and Zane built her a schoolroom with windows that faced east so the morning light would warm the desks. In the evenings, they sat by the hearth, her stocking needles clicking, his hand resting on her knee. They didn't speak often of the lives they'd had before. Not out of sorrow, but because what they'd built was enough. Years passed. Josie grew into a young woman who wrote stories by oil lamp and taught her own students beneath the same church roof. Jude took over the cattle drives, lean and steady like the man who raised him. And every morning, Zane laid a cup of lemon balm tea beside the bed before first light, careful not to wake her too soon. They never stopped choosing each other. Not once. Not ever.